One of the churches in my town is about to host an exhibit on the Shroud of Turin, and they've asked me to help with various aspects of it. So today I want to share with you an introduction, an overview of what the Shroud of Turin is, and why it very well may be one of the most important things on earth. But before we do that, I just want to remind you that in essentials of the faith, we need to have unity. In non essentials, we should have liberty or freedom. And in all things, we should have love. And when it comes to the Shroud of Turin, it's very much not one of the essentials of the faith. Also, we need to realize that science might change. I'm going to show you the scientific evidence that this very well may be real, and there might be much greater evidence in the future confirming and showing that this is truly the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. But it's also very much possible that someone will eventually show that this is completely fake. Now, when we look at this today, I just have to say that this is a brief introduction. There are countless books that go in depth and peer-reviewed scientific articles that show the various aspects of this shroud. So you can go as deep as you want when it comes to this. So whether the specific Shroud of Turin is the burial cloth of Jesus Christ or not, we need to realize that there are certain things that are essential to the faith and very important. We need to realize that the shroud, that the burial cloth of Jesus is described in the Bible as the first evidence of the resurrection. In John chapter 20, when they arrive at the tomb and look inside, they say, "He saw the linen cloth lying there, and the face cloth, which has been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen cloth, but folded up in a place by itself." So again, the literal first evidence of the resurrection for the disciples was the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. And when it comes to the resurrection in general, if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile and you are still in your sins. The resurrection of Jesus is one of the biggest essentials of the faith. We need to realize that God is perfect, that we're not, that our sin separates us from him and makes us deserve eternity in hell. But because God loves us so much, Jesus came, lived a perfect sinless life, and died the perfect sacrificial death on the cross for our sins, and was raised from the grave to win victory over death for all who trust and follow him. So we need to remember again that if the shroud is more and more authenticated, it will strengthen our faith as believers, and it also will draw unbelievers to Christ. There have already been many instances of atheists, agnostics, even members of other religions that have looked at the shroud trying to disprove it, but couldn't, and eventually became Bible believing followers of Jesus Christ. So, as evidence mounts, especially if it's authenticated, that's just going to happen more and more. But on the flip side, we also need to realize that there is plenty of evidence for the resurrection, even if the shroud is proven fake. Now, I have a full video on the evidence of the resurrection. I'm going to put that in the comments section, along with any other videos and some other resources that connect to this topic. So I encourage you to look at that if you want to go more in depth on any of those specific things. So just a super brief history of the shroud. The officially documented history begins in the 1300s in France. So of course, if it goes back before that, if it goes all the way back to Jesus, then it was in Jerusalem. And then almost everyone agrees that if it's real, it was brought by the Crusaders back to Europe. And then it found its home in France. And then later it was damaged and barely survived a fire in the 1500s, and then it was pretty quickly after that moved to Turin, Italy, where it still has its home today. Now, what does this Shroud of Turin show? It shows hundreds of wounds from scourging, a laceration on the rib cage that's perfectly consistent with a Roman spear wound. It has numerous puncture wounds around the head, perfectly consistent with a crown of thorns, a chunk of the beard missing, perfectly explainable by someone yanking it out in a false trial, a major wound on the wrist that's perfectly consistent with crucifixion, and it has real human blood. So there's two things on the shroud, or at least two you can see. There's this image that I'll show you in just a minute but there's also very much real human blood that lines up perfectly with the wounds that we see on the shroud. So, just to explain sort of just how it works, I want to show you a painting, an old painting. So, here on the bottom, it shows that this 4 meter long burial shroud, about 14 feet, it starts at the bottom of the feet, wraps all the way around the back, and then goes over the head and then covers the entire front. Then it would be tucked in, bound, and then put in the tomb as the burial cloth. And then on the top, we see an artist's rendering of what I'm about to show you. Here's the actual image on the shroud. So again, this is 14 feet long, and we're going to look at it much more closely, but you can see clearly this image front and back of a man with his arms folded over his groin. And so again, as you look at this, we need to realize the various possibilities. Is this real? Is this the genuine burial cloth of Jesus Christ that contains his actual blood and this image that was created during the miraculous resurrection? Or is it something that was faked later, whether just as an artistic thing or to intentionally deceive people? We need to remember, just look at the various real possibilities, and also remember that the documented history goes back to the 1300s. So if this was created by a person, we need to know that it had to be done with the technology and knowledge that they would have had available to them at that time. And we need to just realize, ultimately, everything on the shown on the Shroud of Turin is perfectly consistent with the biblical description of the death, burial, and resurrection, and with modern archaeology. So one of the first things I want to show is just the nail position. So when you look back to medieval art of around the time that the shroud was first really documented, almost everything, but every one of them shows the nail going through the middle of the palm of the hand, and then even when Jesus was resurrected, the wound was shown right there. And then people later realized that if a nail were put there and a human body were hung from that, it wouldn't be strong enough. It would pull through, it would rip through the hand. It wouldn't be strong enough to hold people. But when we look at the actual evidence of archaeology, we have found people that were crucified and knowledge of how to do it through this part closer to the wrist that would be strong enough to hold up a human body. And when we look specifically at the shroud, I'm going to zoom in closely, we see that that wound, the blood, is right on the wrist, exactly where you would expect a real crucifixion to happen, not the false look that we see in all of the art from that time period. So that's just one of the many things we see. Another thing that we need to see is that the image is photo negative. Now, let me explain what that means and why it's so important. So the way photography works is that there's a plate that would, at least in modern photography, or at least the 1800s, there would be a plate that would receive light through something small, and it would make an image on that plate, and then that could be used to create images and prints that you can then look at and see the image. But then when it comes to that plate, that the image would be negative. It's reversed. Here's just an example of me from one of my videos. That's a normal image, but then the photo negative looks like this. So we see that the colors are reversed, and then that the darkness is reversed also, that anything that's dark in the original is light in the other, and vice versa. So we need to remember that that's what a negative is, and then when we look at the photo negative of the Shroud of Turin, it looks like this. So here's again, that you cut it in half and put it side by side, where you can see much more clearly that it's really a person. You can see the face, the beard, the hands, the legs. So many things are very clear. Now, again, we're going to look a little bit more closely at that even right now. So here's just the actual image is with where the white or the light cloth with the dark image, but then the negative is the dark background with the light image. So again, we need to realize that what we see on the shroud is photo negative already. So then when you look at a negative of that, it becomes a positive again. Now, when we look at the history of photography, this was first developed and realized and understood in the 1800s. So even if you look at the Kodak website, one of the most famous, photography companies, they give a history of photography and they talk about the Shroud of Turin having a negative image. And then the next oldest image is in 1835. So there's an 1800-year gap between the shroud, between, of course, Jesus and then the first negative photo. But even if it were created in the 1300s, that's a 500-year gap between the first recorded negative image and then the second. So again, 500 years. So if you imagine someone in the 1300s creating this, he would have no knowledge of photography, no knowledge of a negative image. So he would have to create this just with zero knowledge when the next example of a photo negative would be 500 years later. So also as we look further into the image, we should realize that it only goes zero point 0.2 microns deep into the fabric, into this cloth, which is about 1/16th the diameter of a human hair. So again, it doesn't even penetrate the individual fibers, the fibers of flax that are on that garment. The middles of those do not have the image, much less all the way to the back. It's just that very indescribably 1/16th of a human hair depth that it penetrates on that cloth. So we also should realize that there's zero pigment or dye. They've checked it, that the best way we can describe it is as oxidation, which happens naturally in air when things age. And that also some people guess that it might have been the image was created as a remnant of radiation. So many people have tested, many people have tried, but no one has been able to say definitively how that image was formed. But again, so narrow, no dye, nothing that we can explain today. Another fascinating aspect of the image is that it shows depth. The darkest areas on that image were closest to the skin, that got the most of that dark image were closest to the skin. A normal photo, almost any other way that we can make an image, doesn't show this. The real three-dimensionality of the object that was contained in the Shroud of Turin. And again, the greatest scientists and artists from around the world since it was first found have tried, but not been able to reproduce an even remotely similar image. So the image is inexplainable by anything that science or art can really do. It's just an indescribable image on the Shroud of Turin. So that's the most famous part. But something that I find on equal terms, if not more impressive, is the pollen. So it can't be seen without a microscope, but several types of pollen have been found on the shroud, which are rare and indigenous to Jerusalem, but not Europe. So the pollen from flowers in the Jerusalem area that are not indigenous to France. So again, imagine someone trying to make this as a fake. That pollen was not understood. That the existence and functionality of pollen was not understood till the 1600s. Again, 300 years after the documented history of the shroud. So for someone to do a fake, they would have had to go 3,000 kilometers, 2,000 miles from France to Jerusalem, find these flowers that are indigenous there, bring them back, and sort of shake them over the shroud at various places. And that even though you couldn't see it with the naked eye, and even though it would be 300 years before people understood the importance of pollen, that someone would have had to do this from the beginning. So again, just completely unexplainable. Anything other than it being real, anything other than it being miraculous. Now, there are some issues that people have brought up that are challenges. Some of them are very easy to counter and to explain, but some of them, again, are just completely unknown mysteries that each person is gonna have to choose what to believe and take by faith. But by far, the most famous example for the shroud is the carbon dating, because in 1988, 3 samples from the shroud were sent to different laboratories and tested with carbon dating, and they all showed a medieval medieval dating time, which would show that it would be a fake, that it was created in France in the 1300s, and that these tests aligned with that. So many people completely wrote off the shroud, said that it's fake. I haven't really looked at it even since 1988. But there's a lot of explanations to that case, and then even so much more that we've learned today. So some various explanations is that there was continuous contact from the shroud to people. It was viewed as this miraculous thing. People would cry with it, they would pray, it would go from place to place. So there was continuous contact with people that would continuously add carbon from themselves into the shroud. Carbon dating works best in a cave that hasn't been or something like that, where it hasn't been disturbed, hasn't been changed for a very, very long time. And the shroud was always in contact with people. So that could explain the different date. We see the fire that was documented where it barely survived, where, of course, when fires happen, trees burn and there's carbon released. So that very easily could reset the date on the shroud. But then the biggest one is cotton patches. So the original shroud was made with flax fiber, but even in those specific, the documented things that were sent to the lab, it was found to have cotton in the sample that they tested. So after the fire, the shroud was patched with cotton patches, which were from the 1300s. So it seems very clear to me that it's very easy to explain how these tests could be debunked, how the carbon dating really didn't work well. And something that actually just came out recently is a better test called WAX, the wide angle X-ray scattering, which shows perfectly comparable with the first century dating of the shroud. So this newer test shows that it's completely compatible, the actual shroud, with the first century dating, that of course would make it real. Another thing that some people challenge on the shroud is that it can't be real blood because it's still red. Now again, I've already told you the blood type, it's AB, but the way that this works, and of course any of us know, when you get a cut, when you get blood on clothing, within a few hours it turns to a dark brown and then eventually black, and it doesn't look like fresh red blood. It looks dark brown or even black. But the blood we see on the shroud very much is still red even after all that time, and people thought that was bad, that couldn't be real blood. But the answer is actually incredible, because blood from torture victims remains red. When someone is under extreme duress and pain, various parts of the body produce chemicals that get into the bloodstream that actually prevent blood from turning that dark color over time. So again, it's just even further evidence that this truly was from a crucified person that experienced great agony, that is the blood that we see on it. Now, another more modern challenge to the shroud is just the fact that it shouldn't be possible to make a 2D image out of a 3D object without distortion. So the most famous example of this is a globe. When you have a round Earth, a round globe, trying to project that onto a two-dimensional image shows great distortion. So that's why the bottom and top of a map, that's why Greenland looks so much bigger than it truly is when you look at a two-dimensional map compared to the real world or a globe. So the same thing should have happened with a rounded body and a rounded head. There should have been a tremendous amount of distortion on the shroud if an image were projected onto it, but that's just simply not what we see when we look at the shroud itself. And again, no one has a perfect description. Some people say it might have been that radiation might have somehow been only going forward and backward, not sideways. There might have been some type of fog or a remnant when Jesus was resurrected, where the shroud sort of collapsed in on itself and some of it fell on the back, some of it was picked up by the front. Again, it's just completely indescribable what happened. So when you look at what should have happened with a normal 3D projection, it would look like this. You see the normal image and you see the green is what should have been distorted. The arms, the legs should have been much more rounded, but especially the head should have shown much more image all around it. But that's just simply not what was seen. So again, maybe we'll figure this out in the near future. Maybe it'll show something bad. Maybe it'll show something good. But we need to keep an open mind even as science continues to look at this. So another thing that when you specifically look at the biblical account, it describes two cloths. So what about the one that covered Jesus' head? So again, the burial linen, the big one was laying on the ground, but the one that's covering the head in a normal burial was folded neatly on the table. That's what we see in the book of John. So how do we explain this? Well, again, this can go down a whole different trail, but just some possible explanations is that the head covering might have been used sort of just for privacy as he went from the cross until the tomb, until he was put in the burial cloth, the shroud, and then maybe it was taken off so that it would have gotten blood and other things, but not gotten the image. So again, when we look at the incredibly thin image, if there would have been a cloth on Jesus' head, that the image would have been onto that small cloth, not the big one. But that's just not what we see when we look at the full shroud. So maybe it was different times. Maybe the head cloth was used at one point, but then taken off before the full shroud was put on. And then another one that's interesting is a theory that I've heard from some people is that when you're buried and when people die, you often have your jaw open and it's kind of open and natural, relaxed. And they didn't like that for various things, so they very well might have used that cloth to put around the cheek, around this, behind the beard, and just to tie and to close the jaw so that, for burial, the person would have looked more appropriate. And this is fascinating. That's a fascinating theory because when we look back at the original image close up of the face, we see that darkened part next to the cheek, between the cheek and the hair. There's a dark spot where that image really isn't shown. So it very well may have been that other cloth was put right there to hold the jaw shut, and that it would have been there when Jesus was resurrected, and then he folded up neatly and put it to the side. But also, again, you can go as deep as you want on this, but there's something called the Sudarium of Oviedo. So Sudarium is the Latin word that describes that head covering, and Oviedo is a town in Spain where another artifact can be found. So here's a picture of what claims to be the head cloth, the head covering that was buried with Jesus Christ. So again, it has blood on it. It's fascinating because that blood is also AB, which is the same as the other one and is incredibly rare. So this image by itself doesn't necessarily look like that much, but when you compare it to the image on the shroud with sort of a face drawn in, you can see that there's many points of contact that show the same thing on the Sudarium as it does on the shroud itself. So you're going to have to make your own decision about that. But some people and that other Sudarium hasn't been studied nearly as much as the Shroud of Turin. But some people say things like this quote, that it's beyond a reasonable doubt that both were used for the same person, that the Sudarium covered the same person that was used for the shroud. And when you look at it, so even with forensics, when it comes to low quality images, sort of on a recorder or something like that, there's typically needs to be somewhere between 8 to 12 points of connection between the real person and the image you show to be able to be used in a court of law. 8 to 12 is the expectation, or at least the minimum that's needed for court evidence. Well, the Sudarium has 20 points of similarity with the Shroud of Turin. So again, crazy stuff. Science hopefully is going to continue affirming the shroud, even with new things. But we need to hold it loosely. We need to realize that the resurrection is of utmost importance, but specifically the burial shroud, that can just be something that benefits it. There's plenty of evidence for the resurrection, whether the Shroud of Turin is legitimate or not. So again, if you're watching this video, if you have questions, comments, prayer requests, please let me know what you think. And if you'd like to hear more about how to put faith into practice, along with the evidence for the accuracy of the Bible, I hope you'll look at our other videos and like, subscribe, and follow this page because we have so much more to share. Thanks, and God bless.